Good morning, and welcome to the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy's live weekly broadcast. I'm Roberta Oster, the Communications Director. Our program brings you the insights and perspectives and resources from faith leaders, community leaders, experts, legislators, and people in our traditions. Thank you for being with us today. We will also share opportunities for you to get involved in our work advocating social justice and welcoming our neighbors. On the broadcast, you can ask questions live on Facebook, so please write in your questions. We greatly appreciate your participation. Our program focuses on our mission, advocating economic, racial, social, and environmental justice issues here in Virginia. We keep you up to date, and we keep our elected officials accountable. Today, we will be addressing the critical issue of evictions and utility moratoriums in Virginia. And I am thrilled to welcome our guests who are both on the front lines fighting for economic justice. Our first guest, Cassady Craighill. She's the Communications and Advocacy Director at Clean Virginia. Welcome, Cassady. And Dana Wiggins, who is the Director of the Center for Community Outreach and Affordable Clean Energy Project at the Virginia Poverty Law Center. Welcome, Dana. And our moderator is the Reverend Dr. Faith Harris, who is my friend and colleague and co-director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Welcome, Faith, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Roberta. I'm very happy to be here this morning and to be in conversation with our two guests. And let me just jump in with a brief statement intro. Many Virginians were anxious to learn the outcomes of the General Assembly session budgeting process related to the utility and evictions moratoriums. This past 7 months have hit some Virginians harder than others. With losses in employment reaching as high as 11% in the early stages of the pandemic. And then our current seasonal adjusted rate is still over 6%. And so I'm delighted to have this conversation and hope that we'll be able to shine light on some of the concerns and issues and things people need to and want to know about the budgeting process and what that means for the utility moratoriums and for the moratorium on evictions. So going into this session, there were high hopes for legislation that would create resolution to the moratorium stopgap measure. And many among the climate and environmental justice communities, as well as Governor Northam and Attorney General Herring, were hoping to see some of the overcharges paid by Dominion ratepayers over the past few years used to help those unable to pay their utility bills and to make payments because of loss of employment. Would you explain to those who may need to understand how we got here with the moratorium and the utility shutoffs, and why there were hopes that we would be able to use that those overages to create a resolution? And let's start with we can start with Cassady if we'd like.
Sure. Thanks, Faith, and thanks everyone for joining and taking time out of your morning to talk about these important issues. So yeah, to Faith's point about Dominion Energy's overcharges, there was a lot sort of happening at once this summer that I think it's important to add a little bit of context to everyone. So almost the exact week that the special session kicked off in August, we found out that Dominion had overcharged their customers by $502.7 million in just 3 years, so since 2017. That number is actually, to put it in context, is actually twice the amount of the actual budget shortfall that the General Assembly had convened to solve and to reckon with. So, and also the debt that at that point that from overdue utility bills that we were talking about was around 116 million as of the end of July. So those are sort of the numbers we are working with. Another thing that always sort of adds a little bit of salt to the wound is that as unemployment numbers and COVID cases were soaring this summer in late June, Dominion actually doled out its largest dividend payout in recent history, so $787 million. So I bring all of that up because Dominion has not taken any kind of financial hit during this crisis, while families and businesses have really suffered. But unfortunately, with those facts, lawmakers allow Dominion to pocket millions of dollars that belongs to Virginians. So really important for people to remember that the overcharges are money. That is money that does not belong to Dominion. It belongs to families and households all over Virginia. It is simply just getting overcharged for something and then not getting it back. And I'll just quickly say a little bit about what the governor had proposed. Clean Virginia and dozens of other organizations called for really just no strings attached return of this money through debt forgiveness and for immediate refunds. And the Northam's administration mostly agreed and put forth a really common sense solution. Let's use a portion of that, $320 million, and use it for refunds and that debt forgiveness. But unfortunately, Dominion was successful in convincing budget committees to really water that proposal down. And I know we'll talk later about the repayment plan and what protections are in the budget language that will help customers. But the truth of the matter is that Dominion still is getting away with pocketing millions of dollars that does not belong to them in the middle of an economic crisis and global pandemic. So yeah, that's kind of my take on what we hope to happen and what where we are now. And we'll talk more later about some of the specifics of that. And Dana, definitely want to hear your take as well.
Yeah, I think maybe from the VPLC perspective, we went into the special session kind of understanding that, well, we wanted all of that money to go back to consumers. I think on some level we understood that, that is a lot easier said than done, and the $500 million in overcharges really was the numbers that Dominion had actually already sent to the State Corporation Commission as their own numbers. So those numbers aren't sort of conflated in any way. Those are just the amount of money that Dominion reported to their regulator about what they had overcharged their customers. But, the way that the system is already set up kind of prior to COVID was that, the company could offset what it overcharged to customers. It could offset that with some investments that it made in certain kinds of projects. And then it also could share in any over earnings with its customers in a 70-30 split situation. So, there was already kind of a construct around that said that they got to keep at least a part of that money anyway. So for us, while we did work with Clean Virginia, we worked with the Southern Environmental Law Center, we worked with the League of Conservation Voters, we worked with lots and lots of other groups, the Interfaith Center as well. We worked with lots of groups to push for some, returning that money back to the customer. We did also advocate at the same time, knowing that there was a history of just not necessarily giving overcharged money back to customers directly. We did also push for there to be a repayment plan because we knew that the moratorium was so important when it was put into place, but that it also meant that there would be mounting debts for consumers and that they may or may not be in a position to pay back right now. And as some people are reemployed, many people are still underemployed if they are employed or if they are reemployed, many of them are underemployed from where they had been. And so we knew that there would still need to be a path to recovery. So we had proposed a repayment plan option, knowing that just from past experience, it was less likely that very much needed economic stimulus would actually go back to consumers directly.
Thank you both for giving us a little background and helping us to understand what the hopes were and what the ultimate goals and desires may have been. So now that we know what we wanted and what the governor and Mark Herring, also Governor Northam and Mark Herring also were interested in seeing happen, tell us and help us understand, Dana, how does it stand now? What did we get? And what does that mean for going forward related to the utility moratorium? What does that mean for customers? What does that mean for those of us those of us who have paid the overages, but also for for the many Virginians who are still unable to meet their utility bills?
Well, so I think it's important to understand that it's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's some good and some not so great. At the end of the day, for folks who are really struggling, who may be behind in their bills, for anybody who had an arrearage of at least 30 days as of September 30th of this year, the agreement that has yet to be signed, so it doesn't go into effect yet, but it has yet to be signed. But the agreement that was made between the budget committee members was that they would get relief from those debts that were 30 days or more, if you were 30 days or more in arrearage as of September 30th. So those folks will be have some relief, and that includes businesses, so commercial debts as well as residential debts. So, for many small businesses, I'm sure it can be a real relief to not have that hanging over their heads as well. And so for those consumers, that is a benefit, and that will amount to somewhere between $80 and $100 million approximately. It could be a little bit more, a little bit less, worth of debt that would be covered out of that $500 million of overcharges will go to that. But at the same time, this process has taken a while, so the actual moratorium on utility shutoffs has actually expired. And so that is also just something to keep in mind. We hope that lawmakers and the process can actually finish soon, so that the measures that I'm talking about will actually take effect. Once the budget is signed, it will take effect immediately. So we're hopeful for that. But it is important to understand that the utility shutoff moratorium has actually expired. It expired October 1st. But the other thing to understand about what was actually decided on is that there will not be any general relief or returning of those funds to customers, to all customers. We had hoped that there would be a rebate for all customers, as we had just talked about, but that was not part of this agreement. So for any customers who aren't in arrears, some of them who are struggling right now to pay their bills, even if they are keeping up with them, but maybe just tenuously, they will not have any relief, and any of the, especially for commercial customers, for business customers who may have quite large bills that they're paying, there won't be any rebates for them either. We had hoped that economic stimulus would happen, but that did not materialize in these negotiations. And then, there's also the ability to have a repayment plan. Oh, sorry. On top of that, there was $100 million in CARES Act money. So if you're not a Dominion customer, and for other kinds of utilities, all other kinds of utilities, they did offer, there's $100 million worth of CARES Act money that would be set aside to alleviate those kinds of utility debt arrearages that may exist. And then for any debts that aren't alleviated for utilities, there is a repayment program available that was put forth as part of this budget language that allows for anybody who has an arrearage of at least 30 days for any type of utility that covers water, sewer, electricity, and gas utilities. It doesn't matter if they're regulated by the State Corporation Commission or if they're from a local authority, for example. They are all covered. And they have the opportunity to have up to 24 months to repay whatever debts that still exist. So hopefully for a Dominion customer, that debt will be alleviated. But for those who are from another utility, they will have the opportunity to reduce their debt over time up to 24 months to help them in their recovery. We wanted that to be that long because honestly, we don't know how long people will be in recovery over this, this pandemic. And utilities should be something that people should be able to easily cover because it's so necessary for staying healthy, for reducing the spread of the pandemic, and also to keep their kids educated, to keep themselves employed. We need to have access to electricity and running water. And so we're hopeful and thankful that that this provides that opportunity for folks having an up to 24-month repayment period. They also, that repayment period, the moratorium through this legislation will be extended to 60 days beyond the state of emergency. So as long as we're in the state of emergency, the moratorium is also in place against shutoffs, and then it extends it to 60 days beyond the shutoff of the end of the state of emergency, which will allow for even more time for people to sort of sort things out, to catch up before they have to start repaying on their utility debts. And then on top of that, it does also allow for those who as they enter into those repayment plans, it means that they can't have any additional deposits or extra fees charged to enter into a deposit, to enter into a repayment plan. They don't have to pay down a deposit or pay any extra fees, and it won't be put on their credit report as anything except for that they're current.
Cassady, same question to you. Dana just filled our heads with lots of really good information. But same question to you. What's your take on what as it stands now? What's the outcome of this for Virginians?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Dana. It's definitely a mixed bag. It would be hard to pass a budget like this and not have some mixed outcomes in there. But the repayment plan, for sure, 100% agreed. That will actually help people, and having it extend towards 24 months. I mean, we don't have, there's kind of no end in sight right now to the crisis we're in. So it's really important that that repayment plan be as generous as possible. And I also would like to give credit certainly to not only Governor Northam, but also Attorney General Mark Herring, who has really tried to both advocate for a stronger plan for Dominion customers in particular, and having those refunds, and also warn against plans that would disproportionately shift the financial burden to customers rather than to shareholders. So that's, the Attorney General's office actually warned about that back in June when the moratorium extensions were first coming down from the State Corporation Commission. And other states have actually taken a different approach where customers immediately get those overcharges back. Shareholders share in this financial burden of these unprecedented crises. Unfortunately, the budget that was passed last week, and as Dana said, it doesn't actually go into effect until next month after the election. But it really does let shareholders completely off the hook, and Dominion largely off the hook as well. So that's something we're pretty disappointed in. And as we said, and as Dana mentioned as well, the governor put forward a really common sense proposal. Let's use $320 million of that $500 million that Dominion has overcharged. Let's use that for not only debt forgiveness, but for those refunds, which can provide a little bit of relief right now. That was the whole point of this special session, is how can we get relief to families and businesses as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, this is dragged on and left people in the lurch, and doesn't actually turn around and provide their own money back to them. So that part is very disappointing, although very happy that the repayment plans will be in place soon. They don't add those extra fees, interest, et cetera, as Dana mentioned. But overall, this was still lawmakers really giving a pass to Dominion and letting them off the hook.
It was a missed opportunity for sure.
Yeah, so that's the question that comes to my mind right now, the whole idea of what happens in the meantime before the budget is signed into law. What's happening to, I know that there's no moratorium currently, but are utility ratepayers at jeopardy of having their utilities cut off, shut off right now in the meantime, and what protections are there for them?
So I think it's important for people to remember that most of the utilities are part of this process, and all of the utilities that I've spoken with, whether it be the cooperatives or Dominion or APCO, I think they've all said that they're waiting on the process. They don't anticipate starting shutoffs anytime soon. They're waiting through this process to see what came out of it, and so I think we're all kind of just waiting on the legislature right now to actually get this budget bill to the governor to sign, so that these things can actually take effect. So for us, I think the main thing for people to understand is just because the moratorium itself is over, the State Corporation Commission did not extend it yet again in order to help really facilitate the legislators kind of moving forward and with their what they were going to put forward as solutions. It's important to remember, don't panic. It's always important to reach out to your utility to make sure that they understand that you're having financial difficulty. But it's also just as important to sit tight, wait on the process. And, right now we are in, you can enter into a payment plan if you're feeling very anxious. You can still do that. The moratorium might be over, but the order from the SCC saying that people could enter into payment plans up to 12 months is still in effect. And I think the SCC did say as much a few weeks ago. So you can still enter into a payment plan if you're worried, but at the same time, what will be coming will be better options for payment plans. In some cases, for some people, it might be better for them to wait. So make sure that your utility understands your financial situation, that you may be having trouble keeping up with your bills. Make sure that they know that you would be interested if they had help programs available. Every utility has them, but each utility is different. So you need to reach out to each individual utility to ask what options they have available, and then don't enter into anything until this budget bill has passed. So that way you'll know that all the options are available to you, whether you need the 24 months or whether you just need 5 months to pay back whatever debts might be available to you. And then in the case of Dominion customers, some of that debt would be alleviated. And so you don't want to enter into a payment plan when you don't necessarily have to. So I would say don't panic. Nobody seems to be rushing to shut anybody off. Right now, everybody's in a wait and see. That we're all hoping and waiting on the legislature to act and to finish their business. So I would say, don't panic, wait. Make sure that your utility understands that you're in financial difficulty if you are. If you're not, obviously you don't need to, but if you are, make sure they understand that, but don't make any rash decisions until all of the options that may be available to you are open, which will be after the election.
So as a follow-up, the question I have is, what does that mean for how much might be alleviated? Do you have either of you have any sense of what the possibilities are for alleviation once the budget has been signed and and everything starts in motion?
It'll be about $80 to $100 million, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on how many people were in arrears as of 30 days or more in arrears as of September 30th. And that would include, it could include all arrearages that person may owe, not just due to COVID-19. And so that will be hopefully a good benefit for all of Dominion's customers as of September 30th, whatever they may have owed. So that debt will be alleviated. For other utilities, that $100 million worth of CARES Act money, it's that will have to be applied for to then apply to someone's arrearage. And so the ins and outs of that process is a little bit unclear, but I think, we don't know how much debt of other utilities, at least I don't know, how much debt from the other utilities may exist, and how much can be applied. But that's why it was important to have sort of a multi-prong approach to covering this problem, so that there would be some debt alleviation as well as payment plan options for the other utilities, particularly to make sure that people had the ability to have some debts covered, and if some of it isn't covered, that they could have a reasonable repayment plan to cover the rest.
Cassady, did you have any thing you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I think Dana pretty much summed that up. Just wanted to add that in comparison, that the CARES money does cover that. I think again, like the part that irritates me is that the numbers in terms of how much the Maine had overcharged versus how much debt we are actually dealing with, there's a pretty big delta. And so I think that's important for people to keep in context. And it sounds like there's a few viewer questions.
What are we planning for a clean, affordable energy legislation in 2021? We're kind of moving our conversation a little bit into future plans for 2021. And that would be great to hear from both of you what your thoughts are on how will we circle back to this issue, or are there some other issues on the policy issues and policy goals that you'd like to talk about here today?
I would say, at least from the VPLC perspective, there is always seems to be something to work on in the utility space since we started kind of reinvigorating our work in this around 4 or 5 years ago. I would say, our plan is to continue to look at ways that we can help alleviate situations for consumers that cause excess money to be taken from them. It's better if rates are right-sized and utilities just aren't allowed to overcharge, at least not quite as much as they have been overcharging. So we will be looking at policy solutions that look at how do we reduce the amount that's overcharged in the first place. It's just better if the rates are right-sized. Obviously, the utilities are offering a public service. They need to be compensated for that public service, but the fact that we have so many years worth of overcharges just sort of means that we need to have a different setup for how the rates are charged in the first, and what the rates are being charged in the first place. So we'll be looking at solutions around that. And then also there are lots of issues still are, kind of lingering from the VCEA, the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So we'll be looking at ways that we can clean up and sort of make more clear some of the things that will be affecting consumers that have come out of that. And then looking at ways that we can, again, reduce the energy burden for Virginians in general, energy burden being the percentage of your income that you pay towards your utilities. Utilities are such a necessary thing. And I think this crisis has really shown how necessary our utilities are to keep ourselves safe, to keep our families safe and our communities safe, and to keep us moving. And so it is really important for us to reduce the energy burden so that it isn't a question that people are having to say, do I pay for my necessary prescription drugs, or do I take my child to the doctor? Do I stay home from work because of COVID or another illness? Or do I try to power through to make sure that I can pay my utility bill? And so we don't want that to be what people are asking themselves. So we're going to still be working on solutions to reduce energy burden, both through energy efficiency, but also through changes to the system that help make things more fair.
Yeah, and for Clean Virginia, we are always interested in basically shifting the balance of power in Virginia. How can we put more power in the hands of families and consumers in terms of their energy choices, and less power in the hands of utility monopolies? And so we will certainly be seeking ways that we can promote and advance zero carbon energy that is also affordable and distributed across Virginia. So yeah, things like energy efficiency, things like distributed solar, those are policies that we really want to prioritize, since that empowers more people across Virginia. And we also are constantly looking for ways to fix the regulatory structure and making sure that the oversight is stronger. There's obviously a problem in Virginia with Dominion giving a lot of money to the legislators in charge of regulating them, and that is something that we are that is always on our bucket list to fix.
Yes, I think that that's that both issues are clearly important. Again, we started off this special session with hope, with great hope in finding ways to get those overcharges and return to ratepayers, and not be able to have that as our ultimate outcome is disappointing. And I think that I look forward to the ways that we'll be able to circle back and maybe find new ways to tackle this issue. Will legislators be trying to recover those overcharges for us in the next General Assembly? So do we have on board legislators who are interested in this issue and that we know would be our allies and in supporting? We know that we have Governor Northam, and we know that we have Attorney General Mark Herring, who have already come out and made it very clear that they're interested in this. What other legislators and what other ways can we, the general public, encourage their legislators to take this under consideration and and move to the side where we're encouraging Dominion to be more judicious and gracious in the way that they behave with ratepayers?
Well, I mean, I would say, like, obviously we had some legislators, even just during the special session, that really stood out and tried to stand up for consumers. So I think, we had Senator John Bell, who offered a piece of legislation that was ultimately moved to the Utility Commission, but he was attempting to sort of right the ship in terms of making sure that there were rebates to all Dominion customers. And then we have Senator Jennifer McClellan and Delegate LaSharice Aird, both of whom carried legislation around the repayment programs, really trying to make sure that there was a stopgap there for consumers. If nothing else was there, that they had repayment programs that really not only were here for this particular crisis, but that were there for any future crisis to come, really paving the way for how we should allow people to recover moving forward. I think both of those legislators put a lot of time and energy into those pieces of legislation. And then there's I'm sure Cassady will have more specific people to mention, but there were lots of people who were very, very concerned during this session about this issue. And I think a lot of legislators really did stand up and try to speak to this, really trying to make sure that there were appropriate questions asked of the utilities, but also trying to really understand what their constituents were going through. So there's plenty of legislators. I think all legislators are trying to figure out how to best help their constituents during this time. And, everybody has slightly different versions of what the solution will be. But I do think that there are quite a few legislators who very much in particular really want to make sure that utilities are something that are always there, but that they are fair and more fair than they are right now.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, I think although a lot of the budget outcome was disappointing for Clean Virginia and for Virginians across the Commonwealth, it is very exciting when you look at the newly emergent bipartisan coalition of lawmakers that are really banding together and standing up to Dominion, which has just not happened before. And there's been a tremendous progress in the past, year and a half, 2 years. And that's really, really encouraging. So even a bill in the House that would have returned all of those overcharges during this special session, that was actually introduced by a Democrat and a Republican, by Democratic Delegate Jay Jones and then Republican Delegate Lee Ware, who have partnered up on this issue before. So there is definitely a coalition coming together of both, new legislators and really seasoned legislators as well. And they're really building that firewall of consumer protection and more fair energy policies. So I think people should continue to reach out to their legislators. And if they are one of the good ones, definitely encourage them to keep doing this. It's not always easy to stand up to the biggest monopoly in Virginia, but definitely need that encouragement from their constituents. And then if they're not, really say, this is impacting me. My bills are really high, or my neighbors, my family members are struggling. We need more accountability from the General Assembly.
Thank you both for those. Though I think that's really important for citizens, everyday citizens, to know that there is some way that we can provide some recourse for some of the actions we see and we want to see taken by our legislators. That we can be in conversation, that we should be talking to them, and so thank you for that. Dana, I think we have questions. We had some questions, and earlier our topic was evictions and utility moratorium. And although we don't feel exactly experts, we're not experts on the eviction side, but do you have any information that you could share with us specifically about evictions or the evictions moratorium and the outcomes in the budget process for that, and even in the legislative process? What do we have to look forward to there?
So I think it's helpful, I think, for folks to, well, one, I am not an evictions expert or a housing expert. So at VPLC, we have an amazing housing team. And so for folks who have a lot of interest in the topic of evictions, our experts have put up some really great resources on our website. So if you go to vplc.org and there's a big COVID-19 button that will explain a lot of things having to do, a lot of those resources have to do with eviction. We also have, if you're actually facing eviction or know someone who's facing eviction or who is scared about facing eviction right now and doesn't understand what their rights are, generally speaking, we have an eviction helpline where we have 2 staff who all they're doing is fielding and answering questions and then referring people to where they need to be. If they need legal help, they're making sure they have that. If they just need advice, they're able to provide that as well. So that's just wanted to put that out up front. I am not our evictions or housing expert at VPLC. So we have a wonderful set of staff that are doing just amazing work trying to keep up with the demand for this type of information. But what I will say on the topic of evictions, just really briefly, is that, one, what came out of this special session, it's definitely like utilities in that it is a mixed bag. I think the hard part is that there are less protections for tenants than we had hoped. Obviously, we've been working as part of this process, and we appreciate the things that were put in there to protect tenants. But there are some things, one difference between the utilities and the evictions moratoriums is that the eviction moratorium really sort of doesn't right now. It's sort of piecemeal, and there's the CDC moratorium that's in effect, and but the legislation that we have won't obviously won't take effect until January well, it will be there until January 1st. And then after that, tenants have to, or landlords are supposed to be seeing if there's relief out there for their tenants. And then tenants can also look for relief programs. But before January 1st, tenants cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent unless they refuse to apply for the Virginia Rent and Mortgage Relief Program. And so that's something that can be helpful. The CDC declaration for tenants, they don't have to fill out anything. They're supposed to be covered. We have heard from around the state that is not necessarily being covered equally, and sometimes courts in different parts of the state are not looking at it the same. But that protection is still there. On January 1st, landlords can resume evicting tenants if they give proper notice, if either they or their tenant applies for assistance and the assistance isn't approved in writing within 45 days, they can resume the eviction process. So sort of unlike utilities where we have this really nice thing that's tied to the actual pandemic and tied to the fact that, we all are still under a state of emergency, and then it provides a little bit of cushion beyond the state of emergency for people to kind of get back on their feet, maybe if they're trying to catch up on all of the things. It's a little bit different in the tenant space, and that cushion just isn't there. And starting, January 1st, they can resume, evictions. So I think that's a little bit more tricky and doesn't give people as much cushion, particularly when their housing is, for many people, the largest part of their budget, but also just something very significant. It is really hard to maintain your job, to be focused on your family if you don't have a roof over your head. And so that part is a little bit troubling. But we do know that there is that assistance. There is still assistance available. There is rental assistance that will be available to folks. And so we are hopeful that folks will be able to take advantage of that. The landlords after January 1st must apply for rental assistance on behalf of their tenant within 14 days from when the notice is served in terms of an eviction notice. And so that's really helpful. There is a little caveat that they, unless the tenant has communicated to the landlord that they will apply for that assistance, but the landlord is supposed to be applying for that assistance on behalf of the tenant if they want to evict that person. So that can be very helpful. But the fact that, there is that sort of 45-day time window and courts are really backed up and there's a lot of things happening. So we're just very concerned that there will be a lot of people who fall through the cracks and fall into the gaps. And obviously the faith community is often the place that people have to turn to, and other local agencies in order to help them when they're in that crisis. And I know everyone is stretched thin right now. And so we are certainly afraid that it won't be necessarily the cliff of sort of evictions, but there could still be a significant number of people that face eviction anyway. So there is that. And for more information about what has come out of this session, please look to our website at vplc.org.
So we just received a question about immigrants and the immigration community and recently arrived new Americans who have been especially hard hit. So are there any other protections or special resources that for them in addition to the eviction moratorium, or are there is the possibility that there might be legislation forthcoming that would focus on immigrant and newly arrived Americans?
So there isn't necessarily anything that is specifically pertaining to immigrants in this part of the budget. There may be other parts of the budget that do kind of pertain particularly to that. But to the extent that an immigrant is a tenant, they would still have the same protections and opportunities as far as the rental assistance as somebody who isn't an immigrant. And as far as the utilities, as long as the utilities are in that person's name, they would, be able to be entitled to the relief that's available. So it's not necessarily that there's something specifically in these two realms for immigrants, but there is help if they find themselves in one of either under the eviction moratorium or under the utility moratorium under the budget. They have the protections that are available to any utility customer or to any tenant. But obviously there are issues if, depending on their status as far as like going to court, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would encourage folks to reach out, if they are facing eviction, to reach out to our helpline to get more advice and information on what specific to their specific situation, what might be available to them, and as well as their local legal aid program. Legal aid programs are, provide free legal services across the state, and they are stretched thin like everyone else, but they are an important resource for people to take advantage of, especially if they have questions about their particular situation.
So there are two other questions. Thank you, Dana, for that. There are two other questions that I wanted to raise. One is related to someone from watching the show. One of the viewers asked the question about overcharges and what does that mean? How can you explain it? And what is it exactly? How did that happen? How did it happen that Dominion was able to overcharge ratepayers so much?
Great question. Yeah. So what that means, and you might hear reporters or legislators call it over earnings or excess profits. All pretty much mean the same thing. What happens is Dominion has a authorized rate of return, an authorized profit level of how much they can earn, given that they are a monopoly with, 2 out of 3 Virginians are captive customers to Dominion Energy. So they have a fair rate of return from the State Corporation Commission that is how much they can earn. And essentially, anything that goes over that amount is an overcharge, meaning that we all paid, businesses, households, all paid more, for our utility bills than was actually set by regulators. And so that every year there is a report that comes out, and Dana had mentioned this earlier, that these are Dominion's own numbers. They are saying, here's what we earned. And so they report that to the State Corporation Commission, and then they actually compile a report that usually comes out around August, September every year. And the past 3 years combined was about $500 million, 502.7 million. But they have overcharged every year, essentially. So that's just how much in the past 3 years. So that's what that means, is essentially money that really does not belong to Dominion because it is over their authorized rate of authorized profit level.
I will just note also, though, that so the way our system is set up right now, they are allowed, out of that $500 million, they typically get to have something called an earnings band. So an amount of money above the rate of return that if they're within that earnings band, which is 0.7% right now, they will get to still keep that regardless. So that in this case would be like $134 million, something like that, that they would just normally just get to keep just because there's an earnings band available to them. And then on top of that, without any other customer investments in clean energy, so those customer credit offsets that I think I mentioned way at the beginning, they also get to share in any earnings above the earnings band, which is why they have earnings above the earnings band is still like, why? I don't know. I mean, the system is set up that way, but that seems like maybe a little much. But there is a 70-30 split between the customer getting 70% of the earnings above the earnings band back as a rebate or refund, and the company still getting to keep 30%. So they get to keep their normal rate of return. So in Dominion's case, it's 9.2%. And then they get an earnings band. In this case of the $500 million, it's an additional $134 million that they would get to keep on top of that, just because it's part of an above and below earnings band. And then on top of that, they would get another 30%. And I'm totally blanking on the exact number. Cassady might remember of what that 30% represents in terms of the money out of that 500 million. But essentially, they get to keep under normal circumstances. And that's some of the issues that I think, kind of got highlighted in terms of the budget process and the special session is sort of like, well, why do we have so much money that's been overcharged over time? And that's just the way that the law is set up in this utility compact, is that for providing, the public service of utilities, the trade-off is that the utility customer pays for everything that the utility has. If a utility worker gets a hard hat, that gets paid for by the customer. If they need to make upgrades to their customer information system, in some cases, I think they're still trying to get that paid for, but by the customer. But typically, in some cases, that may be paid for by the customers. If they, the only things that don't get paid for by customers that would get paid for by their shareholders would be their lobbying costs or donations to legislators, for example. But in part, that can, the customer pays for everything else that the utility, if it's a cost to the utility to build a power plant or to buy some pencils, those are paid for by the utility customer because they are providing an essential service, a service that we all depend on. And so there's that. But our law also just sets up that they want to recoup all of their costs, and then they get a rate of return on top of all of the costs that they have. So we pay them their costs for all of the things. And then on top of that, they get the rate of return on top of those costs. And then on top of that, they get the earnings band. And then on top of that, they get 30% of any additional monies that they've charged above that. So it's a system that really is stacked in many ways against the consumer. Not necessarily because I think the paying for the charges, just for the normal cost of business that gets paid for by the customer, that is the utility compact that we all, I think most states and most utilities kind of understand. It's sort of the extra on extra that is sometimes hard to swallow, especially when we're all in a situation like now when, businesses and residential customers could just use that money.
Thank you, Dana. We're about to wrap up. Cassady, is there anything else you want to add, and any last statements from either of you before we wrap up our conversation today? Thank you both for being here. And I think that you've raised some really important questions and helped unpack some really difficult pieces of the way that this works with Dominion and with the legislation and with special session, in ways that I think many who are listening have learned something, learned some very important facts today. So thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thank you. I think the only other quick thing I would add that Dave and I were just talking about before we hopped on is that there is obviously the eviction helpline from VPLC, but then also if people are disconnected, if their utilities are disconnected, we are thinking of setting up a helpline for that. I think it's important to remember that some of these companies have publicly committed to not do that, and we should hold them accountable. So if you are disconnected, or you know of somebody who is disconnected, if you visit either Clean Virginia or the Virginia Poverty Law Center's website and use the contact form or the email addresses on that and just let us know. I think we'll try to get something more formal set up here shortly, since, again, like I mentioned, there's really no end in sight to this crisis, and we're in it for the long haul. So definitely contact us if people are facing those disconnections and having trouble.
I think that's an important point. Thank you, Cassady. We have been fielding a lot of calls. I think some of the viewers may remember that during the summer, the city of Petersburg was having a lot of issues with water, their water authority, and there were a lot of shutoffs, and there were, threats of criminal prosecution of people who they said were stealing water. Or they accused folks of stealing water, and there is still a lot of aftermath for that. So it's important to understand that, most of the utilities, especially utilities that are covered by the State Corporation Commission, are certainly, they have mostly committed to not shutting people off while we're still in this waiting period on the General Assembly. But there are plenty of utilities that are not covered by the State Corporation Commission. So ones that are municipal run, water authorities, gas authorities, and electric authorities that are run by municipalities or smaller groups. And so, or smaller authorities. And so I think it's important for them to understand that, one, we want to hear from anybody who's still having issues either with your utilities. In many cases, so Dominion, for example, actually did shut on people who had already previously been shut off during this moratorium. So that was a really, really important thing to help protect people during this time. But, there may be people that are, people just don't know what their rights are with respect to their utilities, and they may not know if their utility is regulated by the State Corporation Commission or not. And so if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us now. But as Cassady said, we are trying to, make sure that we better understand the issues that people are actually facing, so that the solutions that we're coming up with actually pertain to the problems that you're having. But we also want to hear your stories and really better understand how these things are affecting you. So we are in discussion around trying to set up another helpline similar to our eviction helpline, similar to our predatory lending helpline, that would actually help make sure that we understand what's happening with people directly and their stories and what things that they really feel like they need in this process. So, please stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us to make sure, and you can reach out to me directly. My email address is dana@bplc.org if you're having any specific issues. And I think we'll try to make sure that we're setting something up fairly quickly so that we can hear these stories and try to help navigate these problems for people.
Yes, thank you. Virginia Poverty Law Center does just incredible work, and we're very grateful for your organization and for all the hard work that you and others do on behalf of Virginians every day. As well, Clean Virginia, we're so very thankful for your work as well, and we're so glad that we have this opportunity to advocate for our for ratepayers, but and utilities, all the different utility payers and service, and those who are receiving service from the various utilities in the state of Virginia. And as we continue to advocate in the various general assemblies as they come up, we hope that we'll be able to create better and better laws, more and more legislators who get it and who want to see just a more equitable system for all Virginians. Thank you again for your experience and wisdom, and for your willingness to be here today and entering into this very important conversation that I think has been very enlightening for many. Again, thank you.